It gives me particular pleasure to address fellows and guests here tonight on the subject of the Westminster Retable, as the Society of Antiquaries has been associated with this extraordinary panel painting from the very moment that it was rediscovered in Westminster Abbey. But it's rediscovered by one of our most illustrious fellows, George Virtue, in 1724, and was soon included in Horace Walpole's Anecdotes of Painting in England of 1762, partly based on Virtue's own work, and then examined because of its painting technique, even then believed to be oil, by another fellow, the so-called Governor Thomas Ponel, in 1789, who reported, "I picked off some of the plaster which was cracked with the point of a knife. It crumbled betwixt my fingers like chalk. Under this, a coat of parchment was glued upon the board of a panel." His investigation, of course, does not meet modern conservation standards, but the fact that he noted the parchment was not really believed until modern investigation reconfirmed that, in fact, parchment strips had been used. So it was a very, very pertinent intervention. For art historians, one of the most haunting passages in Virtue's notebooks is his original fleeting description of the painting. Numbering a quick diagrammatic sketch of the 5 vertical divisions of the Retable, he states, "In the first is presented St. Peter standing with the keys in his hand. In the 5th, St. Paul with the sword. In the middle pane, Christ standing and the Virgin Mary on the right, and another, St. Elizabeth, on the left." And in 2 and 4 is filled up with beautiful ornaments, and in each, in 4 divisions, in so many several scripture stories represented. The frame and bordures being beautifully adorned and gilt. Given that Virtue examined the Retable when it was fixed at the top of a tall Elizabethan press or cupboard with its painted surface facing upwards, and I've just reconstructed it by mirroring there, so you've got a complete version there. It is perhaps not surprising that he was unable to identify the scenes. It should also be noted that by placing the Retable out of sight in this way, it may well have been saved from defacement and possible destruction during the Commonwealth. The anonymous dean who may have authorised this use of the panel, far from being demonised, should be remembered for this act of concealment. Having discovered the Retable, Virtue might also have hoped that his work would ensure that it would be better described or become better known to other scholars. He could not have known what actually happened. By 1778, half of the so many and several scripture stories were deliberately removed in order to make the Retable an acceptable new ceiling for another cupboard intended to house the members of the so-called Ragged Regiment. These are waxworks which you can still see at Westminster Abbey. It was because John Thomas, the Dean and Bishop of Rochester, refused permission in 1778 for a new press to house these waxworks that the carpenter Maurice Marsault was commissioned and paid £1, 1 shilling and 6pence to tidy up the existing press for the unveiling of the new waxwork of William Pitt the Elder, Lord Chatham, made by Patience Wright, famous sculptress. And that remember, that is on the inner surface, and it would be the ceiling part just there. You would see this part here. And note the colour scheme in that sort of vaguely Jordan green and white, a bit like a stucco work ceiling. In 1817, John Carter sent a letter to the Gentleman's Magazine noting the high quality of the new ceiling, and he states, "In a box enclosing other royal wax figures in Islip's Chantry has been substituted by way of covering some compartmental work, paintings of figures of a design so delicate and an execution so exquisite that an absolute view alone of the same, and that with the utmost attention, can give the least idea thereof." And in 1827, yet another letter to the Gentleman's Magazine, Edward Blore, the surveyor of Westminster Abbey, rediscovered the Retable, and it was removed to the deanery. He persuaded the dean to have drawings made, some of which survived in the Society of Antiquaries by Stephanov, and suggested a glass-fronted case to enclose the Retable to avoid further damage. Now, this lecture, I just wanted to introduce the thing to you in that way. This lecture will be mostly concerned with iconographical interpretative matters, presented through arguments based on facts supported by comparative analysis of visual evidence, a technique that will be known to many of you. But the subtitle of my lecture, Creating Gothic Painting Between England and France, may seem at first superfluous to these arguments, and the subtitle somewhat contentious. It is certainly true to say that it is very difficult to define what is meant by Gothic painting. The various nationalistic definitions of origins of the term Gothic, whether they favour German, French or even English origins for the style, rely on a vocabulary associated for the most part with architectural forms, which are somewhat mysteriously then applied to figurative art. As a request to you, I would like you all to consider keeping in mind that the main thesis of the arguments I will be presenting here is intended to be that the artist of the Westminster Retable should be considered as one of the most important artists of the 13th century and beyond. I believe his surviving work on this painting represents a moment in the history of European art when form and meaning came together in a way that in effect marks the beginning of Gothic painting. You'll notice, by the way, that it is very, very severely damaged, this painting. We'll only be looking at parts, and I'm not going to explain how it became damaged or why. You'll have to accept the piece in that way. Starting with the central section of the Retable, there has now been better identified the central section, depicting Christ standing and blessing while holding the orb of the world between the Virgin on the left-hand side and St. John, in fact, St. John the Evangelist on the right-hand side, and both are holding palms. I'll show you details of that later. The three surviving but severely damaged miracle scenes on the left of the central division of the Retable are now generally agreed to represent the raising of Jairus' daughter. That's that one there, and you can see her there. She's lost there, but that's her bed, and that's Christ there. I just enlarge that so you can see it a little bit better. And then the healing of the blind man, and again I'll enlarge that so you can see it better. That is Christ bending over there with his hand there, and this is the blind man here kneeling in front of him. And the feeding of the 5,000, and I'll enlarge that as well. So you can see Christ standing there, and this particular detail here is a piece of bread, and this is a crowd on the other side. St. Paul, probably severely damaged even in Virtue's day, probably stood on the right-hand side. The image met the same fate as the four scriptural scenes on the right of the central grouping, but St. Peter survives on the extreme left. This much has been known and described many times since the middle of the 19th century. I want now to concentrate on the particular grouping of the standing figures in the centre of the Retable, and then the narrative scenes contained in the star-shaped panels. The standing figures appear to be straightforward in their iconography, but few, if any, comparisons have been made that suggest sources for the particular arrangement of the figures, apart from the obvious Benedictine pairing of St. Peter and Paul at the edges. In particular, the figure of Christ blessing and carrying the orb remains enigmatic. Since the recent technical analysis of the Westminster Retable at the Hamilton Carr Institute in Cambridge, it has been possible to suggest more clearly that it was intended for use at the high altar of Westminster Abbey, and that it was almost certainly made for installation in 1269 or soon after, when the altar was rededicated after the translation of the body of St. Edward the Confessor from in front of the high altar to the Confessor's chapel behind the sanctuary. I show you that view to give you an idea of the richness of this object in its materials: glass, imitation cameos, imitation enamels, architectural woodwork, gold leaf, and oil paint. The entire thing is painted in oil medium, which is actually quite common at this date. It has been possible to suggest that it is much earlier than we once thought, and there are reasons for this. If we look at the Retable itself, the technical report has shown that the changes were made during the construction, but the important thing is to note that English wood was used where you see the red crosses there, and German or Baltic or Northwest European wood was used at the corners, but that we now know because of technical analysis, that these boards were probably done before 1270, cut before 1270. And we also know that there is underside paint, and there were battens coming down the centre. The battens that you see going across were put in as supports in modern times. These are the original battens, and you notice that the battens here are larger, and they were cut off and extended lower below ground level, as it were. And if we examine the retable itself, we see that there is a join, and we know that it was completed before the joins were actually put masked later on. So you can actually see the changes in wood colour there, if you're very, very sharp-eyed. Technical reports showed that changes were made during the construction of the retable so that it could fit the length of the new high altar. Extensions were made to accommodate the canopies and figures of St. Peter and Paul at the extreme left and the right-hand sides of the retable. Originally, the retable terminated with the star-shaped panels that accommodate the miracle scenes. And we can see the points where that occurred. The technical drawing shows the use of the square root of 2 in the design of both the original and the extension. This is quite common again in medieval art. As a panel without the terminal figures of St. Peter and Paul, the retable has the form more commonly used in surviving French, Scandinavian, Catalan and Italian antipendia. That is to say, things that were placed at the front of the altar, low down, not at the back of the altar, high up. And this is a comparison between the Mariatavlen in Logum in Denmark, which has surviving feet, and this is actually a demonstration of how it was probably an antipendium, and we know many, many others that look like this with surviving feet. But there are no retables that do this, because as you notice, the 2 buttons that come down on the extremities were wider and deliberately wider, and these were extended. So something happened to this painting to extend it. As a panel without the terminal figures of St. Peter and Paul, it is impossible to say, but probable that the change may have altered the function of the panels that we now call the Westminster retable from antipendium to altarpiece. In itself, this is significant, as the form of the altarpiece has been created at this time all over Europe. What is more certain is that the original scheme would have included at least the figures of St. Peter, the patron of the abbey, and St. Paul, in accordance with Benedictine practice, and that the central section of the retable would have been the only place where such figures could have been placed because of the arrangement of the panels. This suggests that the current iconography of the central panel may have been changed when the retable was extended, not just by the addition of St. Peter and Paul, but by moving them from the central section to the periphery. If we look at these 2 of the numerous innovations found in the retable, be they technical, compositional, or decorative, or iconographical, the depiction of the standing Christ blessing and holding the orb of the world may be the most profound because of the resonance it has beyond the 13th century for European culture. And I just note here that this arrangement of Peter and Paul with a central standing or seated figure of Christ is quite common. I give you 2 examples there, one from Mount Sinai, one from Aschaffenburg. The familiar label for such a figure holding an orb is the Salvator Mundi, but I know of no evidence for the use of this term in the 13th century in direct association with an image, and little evidence for its use before the 16th century. The label Salvator is associated with a Christ blessing and holding an orb executed by Dürer in about 1507, but this is in an inventory of 1573. No evidence that the term Salvator Mundi was associated with early images of Christ blessing with an orb can be found, although it has become a standard iconographical term used in modern times. The image of the Westminster retable appears to be one of the earliest pieces of evidence of such an image being used as a central theme on a work of art designed to be used as part of an altarpiece. It should be placed as the beginning of the development of the iconography that we now understand as the Salvator Mundi in the 13th century, which is also linked to the devotional imagery of the Holy Face that became increasingly popular at this time. One of our fellows, Michael Kaufman, has explored the use of imagery associated with Anglo-Saxon and Ottonian images of Christ God holding the orb, but has rightly, I think, concluded that these images belong to a post-Carolingian tradition, where the regalia of kingship, such as the crown and the orb and the sceptre, become associated with the image of Christ God and even the Virgin. The tradition goes back to Roman images of rulers, which was adapted and adopted during these periods to emphasize the regality of Christ God. The image on the Westminster Retable does not come out of this tradition, but can be traced to ideas that are first explored in the opening pages of all the surviving Bible Moralise manuscripts produced in Paris under French royal patronage during the late 1220s and early 1230s, where the image of God as creator of the world is depicted with compasses inscribing the circle of the universe, such as the copies that I'm about to show you, this one in Vienna, a vernacular Bible Moralise. Recent work on the Bible Moralise, manuscripts produced in Paris during the reign of St. Louis IX of France, has suggested ways in which these books were used as a political act of gift-giving, and we've been reassessing this role recently in the literature. They represent, just to explain what they represent the most ambitious illustrative project ever attempted in the history of European book production. Each verse of both the Old and New Testaments is illustrated, and each of these illustrations has an accompanying moralization also illustrating. It is a truly monumental task. And I show you the other one in Vienna here to show you those roundels with the biblical text as the top, then followed underneath with the moralization. And I'm sorry, I don't have time to explain any of that. John Loudon suggested that these images define the whole context of the decorative scheme of the Bible Moralise, as each illuminated scene in these manuscripts is contained in a circle as inscribed by Christ God himself in the opening miniature. At Westminster, the importance of the globe held by Christ God as the Orbis Terrarum is particularly significant because of the Latin inscriptions incorporated into the great pavement in front of the high altar. At the centre of the pavement, the inscription in translation reads, "The spherical globe here shows the archetypical macrocosm." Around it, a careful but obscure reference to creation of the pavement, and all creation is also made. And as part of the payment, again, I'm not going to go into any detail, we know, of course, that Abbot Richard Ware is involved in the importation of materials for it. If the Retable were part of the scheme of refurbishment of the high altar, ready for the translation of the relics in 1269 or soon after, and this seems increasingly likely, it would be an obvious iconographical innovation to show Christ holding the globe of creation in this context. And what I'm showing you here is, I think, what's called a mashup, because the Retable then appears there participating in the royal wedding. I hope you don't mind me doing that. There are other contexts which suggest that the moment of the invention of this iconography at Westminster on the Retable represented the coming together of a number of culturally diverse sources. The image of the standing Christ on the Retable forms part of a central focus which can only be paralleled in Byzantine art in the form of the deesis, or prayer of supplication, Byzantine Christian Orthodox iconography, in which Christ stands between the Virgin and St. John the Baptist, not the evangelist, I should add, who act as intercessors through whom prayers may be addressed to Christ because of their familial relationship to him. This form of the deesis had already been imported into Western Europe in the 13th century, and examples that appear to be direct copies of Byzantine iconography can be found, for instance, in the Hildesheim Psalter, there on your left. The substitution of John the Evangelist for John the Baptist suggests that the original meaning of this iconography was not necessarily transported with the appropriation of the composition. I show you also an original there. That's a Byzantine ivory of the deesis from the Precious Gospels of Burnmore, no doubt the source for the iconography that came into Europe. Here I'm showing you another example where there's a substitution taking place, where at St. Mark's around about 1250, St. Mark is shown on the right. In fact, the globe held by Christ God as creator becomes a standard feature of English medieval art from this time onwards, and can be found in numerous examples in illuminated manuscripts and Opus Anglicanum embroidery, such as the John of Thanet panel in the Victorian Albert Museum. It's perhaps through the intermediary of English embroidered textiles, which were known and admired at the papal court in Avignon, that the earliest and most famous manifestation of the image of Christ's blessing carrying the globe of creation was made outside England by Simone Martini around 1340 at Notre Dame des Doms. The humanity and delicacy of execution of the face and hands of Christ and the care taken in depicting the scene within the globe by the artist of the Retable is matched by Simone Martini. However, as the late Andrew Martindale pointed out, the first stage synopia that has survived indicates that Martini changed his mind, or was instructed to alter his work, as Christ originally carried a book in the manner of Pantocrator, or as a Christ in majesty figure. That care was taken to make him into a creator of the world is shown in the detail included in the globe. Martindale was right to note that no other examples of this type of globe seem to have survived before this time, only that on the Retable and that depicted by Simone Martini. But this may not be because there were many more that have been lost. As Paul Binsky has shown, the final chapter in the development of this iconography can be traced to the 15th century and Roger van der Weyden's Braque Diptych, where the liturgical significance of the grouping of the Virgin, St. John the Evangelist, and Christ's blessing as a creator with the globe of the world is made explicit through the supporting inscriptions. The scroll held by the Virgin tells a story of praise, that of John the redemption. Apart from the obvious Eucharistic implication of this iconography, the pairing of St. John the Evangelist and the Virgin around the central Christ-God figure is also in keeping with the theme of Last Judgment in Western European Christian iconography. But on the Retable, it may have an even more obscure meaning when the attributes of the Virgin and St. John are considered more closely as part of the iconographical scheme. Both carry palms. This suggests a link to the text of the Golden Legend, where the palm is carried first by the Virgin as part of the story of her Assumption through her conversation with St. John, when the palm initially given to her by the angel Gabriel is then given to, apparently given to him. Lo, here a bough of palm of paradise, lady, which I have brought to thee, which thou shalt command to be born to for thy bier, for thy soul shall be taken from thy body. And there you can see the palm more clearly. The Virgin then offers St. John the palm, but he attempts to give it to St. Peter. Thou therefore take this palm and bear it to for the bier, when ye shall bear my body to the sepulchre. Finally, and John then says to Peter, bear this palm, they're all trying to give it away, before the bier, for our Lord hath ordained thee above us, and made thee pastor and prince of his sheep, to whom Peter said, it appertaineth better to thee to bear it, for thou art chosen virgin of our Lord, and thou oughtest to bear this palm of light. Eventually, St. Paul gets involved in this story too, but I won't go into that. It is perhaps too far to go to suggest that St. Peter's gesture of pointing to the central panels reflects Peter's statement to St. John, it appertaineth better to thee to bear it. But the subtlety of the iconography of the Retable does not preclude this possibility. The eschatological implications of the grouping are also apparent through John's role as author of the Apocalypse, however. The use of the palm, and here he is standing next to the globe of creation in an Apocalypse manuscript of the early 14th century. The use of the palm as a symbol carried by John in images of him in English Apocalypse manuscripts of the 13th century suggests another way in which this symbol may carry meaning on the Retable, especially as the iconography of the globe appears to have been transplanted from the Retable to a group of apocalypses which use an almost identical composition for the world inside the globe, including a boat or ship emerging from the left, and it is notable, however, that these manuscripts post-date the imagery on the Retable. Now turning back in more detail to the Bibel Moralise I introduced earlier on, our fellow John Loudon has established beyond any reasonable doubt that a copy of the Bibel Moralise additional 18719 was made in England around 1265 to 75. He's shown on codicological and compositional grounds that it is a direct copy of what has become known as the Oxford, Paris, London copy of the Bible Moralise. I do apologise for the complication. Those of you who are not manuscript scholars will probably be thinking, what does that mean? It means that it's one book and it's been divided between these three places, sadly, and we have to call it that. Which, because of its evidence, can be proved to have been in England this time. So we know that this copy is of the Oxford, Paris, London one, which is a French manuscript, and we know that it was copied in England. It remains a matter of conjecture, as no surviving documents survive, as to how the Oxford, Paris, London copy of the Liber Moralise arrived in England and to whom it was given. It has been suggested quite plausibly that it was perhaps given as a wedding or betrothal gift on the occasion of the marriage of Eleanor of Provence to Henry III of England in 1236. St. Louis himself was married to Margaret of Provence, Eleanor's sister, and the rivalry mixed with alliance that this reflects during the period of Henry III's reign is a very well-known phenomenon. These are the two, and I will be looking at them in detail. Some of you with sharp eyes will have spotted the comparisons already, but I'll show you them in detail in a second. Now coming to the miracle scenes, the miracle of the man born blind, what is important for us is that it can be demonstrated that the Bible Moralise provides a hitherto unknown source for the composition of the scene of the miracle of the man born blind, depicted on the Westminster Retable, which confirms the hypothesis that a copy of the Bible Moralise provided compositional and iconographical models in England at this time. So just to go back there, this is Christ here, there's the man born blind on the other side, and Christ is doing something with his hand, which I will explain a little later. You see Christ here bending over and pointing downwards, that's this scene here, which we're looking at. The part of the Bible Moralise that contains the scene of the healing of man born blind, in the copy which was brought to England at some time after 1236 and certainly before 1270, is contained in Harley manuscript 1527, part of the Oxford, Paris, London copy. It has a distinctive way of showing Christ bending down to mix his saliva with mud by pointing to the ground and then pointing to the eyes of the blind man. The same compositionally similar scene is depicted in the 3-volume Toledo copy of the Bible Moralise, the so-called Biblia de San Luis, because it's thought to have been given to St. Louis, by St. Louis to Alfonso X, the wise of Spain. It occurs in the will, a 3-volume Bible that we assume is the same one, occurs in the will of Alfonso X in 1284. It shows instead the closed hand of Christ and the application of the mud. This is important in itself, as it confirms Loudon's observation that the artist working on the copy made in England was working directly from the copy contained in Oxford, Paris, London. Because if you compare the two, there is a very big difference between these pointing gestures, whereas if you look at the one that was copied directly from Harley, the pointing gestures are repeated and also the clothing is repeated. Because the pointing hand can be seen in both, and the grouping of the figures and their clothing is very similar, and Loudon has also demonstrated convincingly through examination of underdrawings and incisions made in the Toledo and Harley volumes that individual compositions in these two books depend on drawings or a model book which is more loosely adhered to in the Harley copy. But the Toledo copy follows a different model. It is the literalism of the scene itself that helps us better to understand its significance in the Westminster Retable. By showing Christ bending over, the iconography of the man born blind diverges from the accepted format of the scene as depicted in all earlier representations in Christian iconography, such as that in the Rossano Gospels. Sorry, I've just explained that's the difference. The Rossano Gospels of the 7th century of and the Maestà of Duccio of 1308 to 11, in which Christ is seen either applying the mud or blessing the man born blind. Moreover, in such scenes, the man born blind is shown later washing his eyes in the pool of Siloam, often in continuous narrative. The literalism of the scene in the Bible Moralise tradition may be an artistic response to the text of the moralization, which demands a clear visual exposition of the actions of Christ in mixing his saliva with the mud, rather than the normal emphasis on the moment of application, and the subsequent scene of the man washing his eyes. It actually says the saliva comes from his head, and this signifies that the Son proceeds from the Father, and this is the important part of it. As Christ does not point to the ground in the Retable scene, it is notable that this feature is also absent from the scene of the healing of the man born blind found in the Toledo copy of the Bible Moralise. This is very significant in that it seems that it wasn't dependent on the Harley and additional copies which we know were in England. In fact, the blind man in the Retable image is also significant in this respect. He does not do he does not do this in either the Toledo or Harleian copies I've just said. What is important, though, is that we can find in the Naples Bible Moralise, 14th century manuscript, and another comparison with the Anjou Legendarium, which also follow the Toledo Bible Moralise composition, a similar kneeling gesture of Christ. And I'm just going to reverse this for you so you can understand this. This is the Anjou Bible Moralise, and I'm particularly interested in the pose of Christ and the back leg of Christ when you reverse it. This is the fragment of the Anjou-Hungarian Legendarium, which I'm not going to explain very much, but clearly depends on the model of the Toledo Bible Moralise, not on the Oxford, Paris, London one. I'm going to show you again the Anjou Bible Moralise there, just to emphasize not only is when I reverse it, you see this very strange backwards movement of the foot, but also the hem moving forward in this way. It is very, very unusual. Looking at the feeding of the 5,000, it comes as no surprise that the scene of the feeding of the 5,000 also depends on the Bible Moralise, and in particular on the composition found in Harley 1527 and repeated in the copy of this composition in additional 18709. The elements that make this composition so compelling are the depiction of the group of the 5,000 on the right as seated, the angle of the inclination of the heads of St. Peter and of Christ, and the central position of the circular loaf of bread. Remember, it's here on the Retable and there in the Moralise. So close are these comparisons that it suggests that the artists of the Westminster Retable did not just use the general positioning of the figures, but appropriated these key compositional aspects of the design. The Eucharistic significance of the central round loaf is particularly notable for its importance in the interpretation of the scene on the Retable. It can also be argued that the rebalancing of the scene to fit the star-shaped field necessitates the inclusion of two heads inclined forwards instead of the one found in the Bible Moralise scenes. And you see that there's only one head, but there are two inclined heads. He's put the second one in order to create the composition. In this case, there is no equivalent scene in the Naples Bible Moralise to compare with it, but the source in the Harleian and additional Bible Moralise suggests a full awareness of the scene and its moralization through the emphasis on the Eucharistic symbolism of the bread that has been emphasized by the artist. It seems that the two surviving models, the Bible Moralise, that are older than the Retable, the Toledo model seems to be closer in its compositions, but neither may have been used directly by the artist. The comparisons with later Bible Moralise and their derivatives suggest that he had learned this composition or carried it in his repertoire of models because he had been trained probably in France and specifically, more probably, in Paris. Loudon's demonstration of the use of common models in the underdrawing of Harley and Toledo volumes also suggests that the artist in the Retable had access to these and similar models. Turning to the raising of Jairus' daughter, perhaps because the Bible Moralise imagery does not emphasize the healing of Jairus' daughter in a pictorially transferable way, or perhaps because the artist of the Retable had already formulated a composition based on other sources, the scene cannot be compared with Harley 1527 or the additional copy or the Toledo Bible Moralise. What is notable, however, is that it does not follow the tradition of showing Jairus' daughter in her bed on the left-hand side of the scene, an arrangement that we found in English examples. And I'll show you the one in Cockford Exits. At the bottom there you can see it goes that way. It also doesn't go that way in French examples, actually. This is Strasbourg Cathedral. Again, it goes the other way. The closest parallels, in fact, can be found in Byzantine cycles of Life of Christ and those of the earlier tradition in the West, such as the 9th or 10th century miracles at St. George's in Reichenau Oberzell. I'll just show you that, where it is actually quite similar in its structure. Of the numerous Byzantine examples, it can also be compared compositionally with the scene in the Church of Christ in Kora in Istanbul and Visoki di Ciani Monastery in Kosovo, where you can see a particularly close way where the bed fits and the figures behind and the architectural setting. It seems very, very close to me, but obviously I can't prove that in the same way as with the Moralized Bibles. Several conclusions can be drawn from the evidence of the compositional and iconographical sources used to create Westminster Retable. These seem to confirm Christopher Wilson's recent observations on the architecture and ornament of the Retable, which suggest that the artist and designer has his origins in France. It is clear that the artist of the Retable was not merely copying from a manuscript or following instructions from an iconographer because of the extra detail he adds to the compositions. But it is also the case that such a statement cannot hold within it the full impact of the meaning of this artist's achievement in terms of the history of painting in Europe. If the date of the Westminster Retable is circa 1269, it seems likely, the figure of St. Peter must be ranked as one of the first fully formed works of art that uses the so-called S-curve in the body as a fully understood form of contrapposto, and one that gives a visual signal to us to this day that we are looking at what we now call Gothic painting. The earlier manifestations of this style are to be found in sculpture and tend more towards a natural, almost banana curve before this innovation. Up until 1250 to 60, much more solid and static figure types had dominated French painting, which is epitomised by the statuesque figures of the Virgin and Child page in the Book of the Sermons of Bishops of Paris, which can be dated to around 1250 quite well, and the so-called Shah Abbas or Masiewski Bible in New York, which show this very statuesque broad fold style with these gatherings at the feet. What concerns me here, however, is not the moment of the invention of the so-called broad fold style, which can be traced to the early 13th century and particularly in sculpture, but the moment of the change in the way the figure is used dynamically and expressively, which can be seen in the arcade paintings of the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, and also in the so-called Psalter of St. Louis at this time, during the 1260s, and in the South Transept sculptures. There is the banana shape, by the way, that I was talking about, and these agitated figures, and you see the banana shape again. And you see it also in the South Transept of Notre Dame. The first stage seems to be a development towards this more banana-shaped curve, which can be seen in the ivory of Virgin and Child of the Sainte-Chapelle, usually dated 1265 to 79, and the ivory of Notre Dame, Virgin and Child, usually put to 1260 to 80 for lack of evidence. But the distinct and more graphic S-curve of the Retable's Peter takes this idea further. And I would like to just point out what I'm talking about here is the fact that the neck goes that way, the gesture goes that way across the arms, the shoulders, and then it comes back down, so you get this kick. And these tend to do this. Obviously with sculpture you can move it round, so it looks slightly different, but actually that's the main theme. And I'm not saying they're not part of this development, I'm saying this is what you see in the Retable. The work traditionally associated with the Parisian illuminator, Maître Honoré, is usually associated with the Westminster Retable. And such as you can see here, two works which are associated with this name, matron array. We're not sure, I'm sure there are people in the audience who know this is a controversial matter, but I'm assuming that for the purpose of this lecture that these are matron array type works. Westminster Retable has been compared many times with these, and if we look at the head types, for instance, the pear-shaped head and the beard and the curls have often been used. And if we look at the breviary of Philip le Bel, we can see again, particularly if you look at the hair and the hair over here and the type of head, they're very, very similar. What we've got to realise, of course, is that all of these works of matron array must post-date Westminster Retable. And the other manuscript that's usually used here is the so-called Evangile de Sainte-Chapelle. And again, I think Michael Kaufman wrote an article in the Warburg Journal pointing out it's probably datable much later, 1285 to 1300, than was thought before. And finally, if we look at a manuscript like the Nuremberg Hours, which we know has been suggested was made for a presentation to Margaret of France on her betrothal, Edward I, we know the calendar is of English use, but the art is certainly French. And if we compare, again, there are similarities, but the Nuremberg Hours is much later than the Westminster Retable. And so the comparisons are never very perfect, although the hair in particular is particularly, you can see that very, very well there. The overwhelming evidence of comparative materials from Westminster Abbey itself shows the impact of the Retable was extraordinary in the history of English art. The technical and aesthetic impact of the Retable's design and figure style can be seen, for example, in the South Transept paintings. And I just reversed that, which we can now do with our modern technology, and actually then put them together. I think you'll see more clearly than I think has been demonstrated elsewhere that this is a very, very close comparison. And a longer lasting effect can be seen in the design of the Sardinia paintings, in their architectural settings, and in the survival of Opus Anglicanum Cope at the Vatican, and in St. Faith's Chapel paintings with the similar star-shaped designs are used. But the artist of the Retable also appears to have inspired specific innovations amongst others to change their view of the world, as is probably the case in the artists of the Dallas Apocalypse, made probably for Edward I and Eleanor of Castile around about 1272 or slightly before, by an artist who, I believe, also worked on the ceiling panels of Henry III's painted chamber at Westminster. And the detail that seems to prove it, not only do they look the same, but on the Dallas Apocalypse, very unusually and uniquely, the outer band is almost in a raised paintwork, and there is a raised band of white lead or gesso around the outside. This is almost unique in English art, and I think that the artists are the same. Having said that, the reason I'm showing you this is not because the Dallas Apocalypse artist should be identified with the artist of the Retable, but because if you compare what's going on with the neck and the body, he's not actually absorbed everything, but he has absorbed something, and he's particularly absorbed the ways of drawing. And the hands in particular are very, very close when you compare the contortions into which the Dallas Apocalypse artist goes into. And not only that, the Dallas Apocalypse itself, which is datable to before 1272 by many people, though it's a controversial date. If we look at the architecture, particularly this detail here, and this detail here, with the canting out and arrangement of shafts, this is very, very unusual as well, and it seems to indicate that the Dallas Apocalypse was copying the design, and also in these areas above, copying the design of the Retable itself. Having said that, there is another manuscript which is less well known, a sister manuscript iconographically to the Dallas Apocalypse in the Bibliothèque Nationale Latin 10474, which is in fact much softer in its approach to modelling, and the head types seem to have responded to the Retable much more closely. And in particular, I show you this particular funny cranium, which seems to be almost directly copied the hands again with these funny extensions, it seems to be a real impact. So, in conclusion, the Retable artist's sensitivity to the innovative iconographical models used to be with Moralise suggests that he may have been party to the discussions about the nature of the central scenes of the Retable, and in particular the innovative depiction of Christ God holding the globe of the world between the Virgins and John the Evangelist. He's an artist who seems to have understood the humanizing and modernizing effect of depicting Christ's blessing with such a detailed depiction of the world in his hand. The humanizing effects of his modelling in oil, which created intimacy and expressionism both through the handling of paint and through the figure style, make his work exceptional in the 13th century. I'd just like to emphasise that through just this detail of the hand, the modelling, the shadows, the whole concept of it as a thing in space, but also a warm hand. That the artist seems to have been aware that the style and method of applying paint had as much meaning as the chosen iconography, and the two could complement each other expressively is the point here. His use of oil medium, not in itself unusual in Northern European panel painting at this date, is also important, because it is the modelling in paint combined with freedom in the depiction of the figure that sees a coming together of artistic expression that is significant, it is extraordinarily significant in the history of European art, and is as important as any innovation in the next 200 years. If, as many observers from Viollet-le-Duc onwards have felt, the artist was trained in France, it is also time properly to reassess his impact on French painting, for it is difficult to imagine the work associated with Maître Honoré, which I've shown you already, without the sophisticated thinking and ability to visualize new and exciting concepts that is epitomized by the work of the artist of the Retable. It seems to me unlikely that the innovatory modelling techniques and figure style combined with an interest in nature and three-dimensionality could have started life within the pages of Maître Honoré's illuminated manuscripts. All of these observations suggest that the Retable itself, through its combination of features from glass inlays to imitation cameos, subtle use of paint, should be placed at the topmost point of avant-garde painting in the 13th century. It seems if it seems likely the artist of the Retable is French, then he should be understood as one of the most important figures in the history of European painting, rather than as an English artist who, to use an old art historical term, came under the influence of France. The artist of the Retable clearly worked in England, but it is time to reassess his work and the effect it had on European painting, particularly in France, and if not on a wider scale. And I leave you with the idea that we need to place this work of art next to the greatest monuments of European painting from the 1270s right through to the 1340s. Thank you very much.
Michael, thank you very much indeed. You've given us a lecture which is both beautifully illustrated but rich in analytical and historical detail. It's given us an enormous amount to think about and a very exciting results of your research. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. I was very pleased that you set it in context for us, in the context of our antiquarians. That was very generous, thank you. And to think that this work has been driven by the work of our society in some ways is also very pleasing. So thank you for that. Do we have any questions? I'm sure we will.
Yes, I wanted to make just one observation and then ask a question of something I didn't quite follow. One would expect ivories to follow a curve because that's the nature of a tusk, but that's different from an S-curve. But the question I wanted to ask was, I didn't quite follow the point I think you made, which was that you thought the St. Peter and Paul may originally have been set further in, but the wood that you indicated suggested that the wood they were on was in fact from another source, and I couldn't see where they would have fitted, because the example you gave had Mary and John, and then Peter and Paul outside them, not instead of them. And had they been outside, how would the scriptural blocks have fitted? Because they seem to be part of the whole, with the other two saints on the extremity, perhaps added or perhaps not added. I didn't quite follow your argument, and I may have misunderstood it.
David Neal, bearing in mind that the Retable was in front of an opening going into the chapel, what was on the back of it? Because it would have been seen.
Well, what strikes me is the astonishing sophistication of these figures, but other aspects too, the painting, the pigments that are being used are quite different from all the other examples that you showed us, and the level of genius and sophistication is superlative. I'm completely bowled over. And it seems to me that this painter is quite an outstanding figure, and I wondered if you had come across any examples of comparable work that you've not been able to illustrate, because I wasn't, although I can see that you've drawn comparisons between the Retable and other paintings, they are not of the same quality and aspiration in my mind.
Which one first?
Just to isolate the very interesting point you were making about the S-curve and the new dynamized human body, I wonder if you have a comment to make. You said you talked about other media. I'm thinking of the sculptures on the elephant crosses, which was obviously late 13th century, and the different sculptors, which I don't know if I have correct use of the terminology. I call it a déhanchement, those putting the weight onto them. I know that's not the full S-curve, but it's part of the new articulation of the human body, and I wondered if you could enlighten me on any comparison there.
Take one last question.
Do you think your artist works exclusively or almost exclusively on pad rather than manuscripts?
Gosh, well, thank you very much for those questions. I've made notes of what they are, and I'll try and not leave anything out. Firstly, to do with tusks, I'm very aware that there are fellows in the audience who have studied ivory much more extensively than I have. But I do believe that it may be a fallacy to assume the shape of the tusk really has an effect on the actual design of those virgin and child groups. If they chose, they would not do that, but they chose to do it. So it's a question of decision making rather than the actual tusk dictating. But I'm willing for maybe other fellows to disagree with me on that. But I think the idea of the figure moving was not actually dictated by tusk, because if you think about it, tusks have been used throughout the history of art, and yet the figure itself and Romanesque depictions of it did not move in that way. So it is actually a syllogism to actually put those two together, in my view. I mean, I'm obviously willing to accept other views on that. With the central panels there, it is, I mean, it's a suggestion that I'm making, because we know that, perhaps I didn't explain fully, and I couldn't because it's too difficult to do so in a short lecture. The central section, we know from the woodwork, despite the planks going across, had its armature installed before the end panels were added. The central panels that went across, the English panels, are very, very high quality oak that is local to London. The end panels are of extremely low quality oak, the type you get on scaffolding panels. And they stuck them on at the end after they had fully designed the centre. So the centre designed to accommodate a central figure and two standing figures either side. Now we can argue who those figures were, but if it's a Benedictine house and a dedicated Peter, you want Peter and Paul there. Where are they going to go? Those are the only places they would go. That's my suggestion. I don't know if it's true or not, because I can't prove that. The front, what was on the back? That's another point that one could explain more fully. One of the most exciting things about taking the Retable out of its case and seeing it at the Hamilton Carr Institute in Cambridge was the discovery that the entire back was originally painted as imitation marble. So it was visible, or intended to be seen as visible, it seems, from the back. And that would make perfect sense. So I think that answers your question very, very well. Having said that, I would point out that many, many panel paintings, and notably a number of paintings by Jan van Eyck, are painted in imitation enamel on the back, but are clearly intended to hang on a wall. And the reason for this is because by painting the back and making it look nice while you do it, you're actually sealing the back. And that affects the movement of the boards over time and creates a much more stable environment for the paint. So there are two arguments there. One, they intended it to be seen from the back, or actually this is a way of making this painting really secure and a level of longevity for it. Sophistication of the painting, well, I'm very glad. In a sense, it actually reinforces what I'm saying, in that this is a very unique painting. I would point out that we do not have enough survival of contemporary painting to make a huge survey. What we do have are fragmentary survivals, and we have illuminated manuscripts. And just to go to the last question, was he exclusively a panel painter or a manuscript painter? There is no model that you can answer that with, other than some manuscript painters, and I would argue very strongly the artist of the Dow's Apocalypse, which I showed you and compared with the ceiling panels at Westminster, could move from one medium to another. Others did not and could not, because they were exclusively illuminators. So there is no one answer to that. There is only an individual answer, and that is typical of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is not about everyone doing the same thing. Individuals do different things, and different circumstances create different things. So the sophistication there, I can't provide you with comparisons other than the ones I've given you at all. There are some paintings at Angers Cathedral which have recently come to light of varying quality that use an oil medium on wall. And there are a whole number of panel paintings from Norway, and there are some panel paintings from Catalonia which can be compared. Very, very little survives from France owing to iconoclasm. Very, very little survives from England, but more than one would think because of iconoclasm. So we're looking at the peripheries, and the land that time forgot was the mountains coming up to the Asturias and all of that. And the land that time forgot is Norway, not Sweden, because the Swedes were more keen on destroying everything than the Norwegians. So basically, you go to the peripheries to find the comparison. So when we do find a good example, for instance, I showed you the panel from Denmark, the quality of the painting is not comparable because they're different types of painters. And with the artist of the Retable, what I hope you've got from this is the sophistication of the intervention in the iconography and the ideas inside the iconography, and then the ideas inside the handling of the paint inside the iconography, mean that artist was working at the very highest level with the patron and with complete interaction in some way. And this could happen at the court of Henry III, Edward I, and Louis IX of France, I think. This is an artist who is moving between these major courts. And I hope he also got the impression that he was aware of Byzantine models, he was aware of perhaps even Southern European models. He was aware, this artist was aware, and not only was he aware in terms of his painting development, but the Retable itself displays many, many aspects of an internationalism that we normally associate with later periods. So he's interested in objects that, comparisons, decorative comparisons with Islamic tiles, Islamic textiles can be made very, very successfully, and I've done that elsewhere, in fact, so that fits well. I'm trying to remember about the S-curve now, so going back to the S-curve, you're absolutely right. This is perhaps the most contentious part of the lecture, and I'm very happy for it to be so. I'm very happy to be informed and develop myself. I would say that if this really is 1269-72, it is incredibly early for it to have absorbed the dynamic of the figure fully. And every example I come before 1265 is slightly less aware of the implications. Every example I get after this artist's work suggests that it's been absorbed and is now being transmitted. So I do see this artist as very, very important in this. He may not have been the only one, I don't know, but certainly he's the only evidence that we've got surviving of this early moment. And we have to thank Hamilton Kerr Institute, Paul Binsky and Massing and all of those people who worked on the Retable in such detail to actually give us, and Ian Tyers on the woodwork, to give us that information that suggests the trees must have been felled before 1270, and that probably at some time before that, so there's a little bit of maturity in that, and then they were painted, because that absolutely gives us the indication that we're confident in what we're saying about the exact point when it was made. It then fits the whole iconographical scheme of the Westminster project round about 1269-72, and that the iconography, I think, then reinforces that because it fits with the pavement. That's all I can say, really.
Well, Michael, that's a wonderful full answers to some very interesting questions. Thank you very much indeed. I've taken the opportunity to be shamelessly opportunistic because our Honorary Vice President Maurice Howard was with us this evening, and I felt that he would be much better than I to do a summing up of what has been a really wonderful lecture. So could I call on Maurice to come and give us a few thoughts on this evening?
Thank you, Jill. As you know, Jill is calling on me for my skills in summarising in an audience full of such great medieval scholars. It's not the knowledge so much, it's just pulling this together as a final vote of thanks to Michael for a wonderful lecture. First of all, on the iconography, fascinating links between different places and different events there, and the knowledge we have of occasions which you brought up. We have to underline royal marriages, times when courts saw things from other places, is clearly a link in terms of iconography as indeed of style, and that was absolutely fascinating. Your cutting across different kinds of media was really very, very interesting. I think one of the key threads though that has gone through, which will interest all of us, is very much about the technical aspects of this. As Jill said, it was very generous of you to mention the role of the society in the 18th century in bringing this great painting to light, and then the subsequent history when it was made into part of something else for a span of its life. And of course I immediately thought of our Saxon kings here, which were also panelling and cupboards and used in ways which we now treat these things with much more respect and admire them. But there is a difference because these panels were undoubtedly fixed to something. They are part of something else. The great thing you've shown us about the Retable is that it really was made to be a beautiful freestanding object with this great painted back and the way it all fits together and the sense of it being an integral thing. I was very struck when we all heard the talks at Westminster last year in the BAA conference by Mary Louise Sauerberg telling us about again, the key things are the technical things we're now discovering about things, which helps us bring all these works of art together. This presence of lapis in the abbey, remnants on St Faith's Chapel, in fragments of glass, in the pavement, and here on the Retable, makes us think about these workshops working alongside each other, making things with and for each other in ways that we didn't previously know a lot about. I think these are fascinating ways, and as you ended up with there, the knowing of the date of the trees is very good. Of course, that goes on. In the 16th century, we've been finding that you import from the Baltic your oak for panel paintings, and then when it needs to be a bit bigger or something, you slot in a bit of English rougher stuff or something you didn't really want in order to make the panel the full size that you want. Traditions of making things go on as well. And you know, it's now more decades than I care to remember since I was a student, an MA undergraduate student, covering a huge amount of stuff in art history. I'm really pleased to see, you know, the debates about international Gothic, whatever it is, are alive and well. Where it starts, how it's transmitted, fascinating stuff with really high quality objects. And I think that sense also that we get is that the oil painting tradition is not one, despite what certain writers since the 16th century have wanted us to believe, is one of discovery, but one of continual sophistication and replacing and mixing in different ways to make different great phases. And you've certainly shown tonight that this great 13th century work is a highly significant work at the start of a new oil painting tradition. So thank you very much for that rich and wonderful lecture and for sharing your knowledge with us tonight. Thank you.